All right, we're live here at Buffalo Trace Distillery for another episode of Whiskey Wednesday. Today we have Master Distiller Harlen Wheatley. And Harlen, looks like we've got several bottles on the table, and I know we're going to talk about some bourbon and other whiskeys. So, how you doing?
I'm doing great. We get a lot of people come through. In fact, we're still on pace even with the COVID restrictions. We're on pace with getting about 200,000 visitors a year here at Buffalo Trace. And, one of the common questions that people have is, what is whiskey? What's the difference between Scotch and bourbon? And, we thought we'd talk a little bit today about the differences in some of the whiskeys and the variety these days. If you go to a liquor store and you look down the whiskey aisle, we've come a long way as far as variety. You can get, that aisle, you almost have to call for some help because it depends on, we try to match consumers' taste to our whiskeys. So, we want to understand, what do you like? Do you like sweet? Do you like, dry or older profiles, weeded, rye bourbons? Just depends on the individual. And one of the things I always say, I was doing a tasting in Scotland one time, and I was talking to a group there, and I said, we've been making whiskey for a long time, about 200 years. And the guy that was sitting there, he was wearing a skirt, and he said, boy, you walked in on a street that's 2,000 years old. And it really kind of put things in perspective for me because, a lot of these whiskeys, the variety is unlimited, really. And, through our experimental program and all the things that we've been doing, there's just so many different ways of making whiskey. But there's a few things that you kind of have to keep the same. You're regulated by the government. And all these are examples of, through regulations and, different types of whiskeys, different types of offerings of flavors that you can offer. We start off with Canadian whiskey. This is our Caribou Crossing offering. And what really makes this whiskey unique is the fact that it's a single barrel whiskey. And, that's never been done before. Similar to our Blantons that we have, that was the world's first single barrel bourbon. Well, we decided to get creative. Instead of Buffalo Trace, we called it Caribou Crossing. And then we wanted to offer the first, Canadian whiskey, single barrel. And, that's what's nice about that. It's the same as single barrel bourbon. The fact that you can be really selective on flavor, really unique package, and, cater to those who like that flavor. Canadian whiskey is a little bit different, because the difference between Canadian whiskey and, let's say, a bourbon is generally Canadian whiskey is aged in used barrels. To be a straight bourbon whiskey, you have to use new charred oak barrels. And with the Canadian whiskey, it's a little bit different because, they'll blend a lighter whiskey with a flavoring whiskey when they do that, and then they'll age it in those used barrels. That lighter whiskey, the majority of that whiskey is a really high proof. So you're getting a lighter flavor. And then with the used barrels, of course, you're not picking up quite as much of those tannins. But another thing that makes it nice, especially for the blenders, is you can add 9.09% flavor. And that flavor could be caramel with color, or you could add a really good whiskey to it. Which is the majority of, the way people add flavor to it. They'll add maybe a more flavorful whiskey to it, and then they'll get that flavor where they want it. So it gives the blenders a little bit of a tool to utilize and get the flavors the way they want. So that's kind of the main difference between Canadian. They have that flexibility with adding flavor or color, and then that's used barrels, and of course made in Canada. That's the big thing for that. But Caribou Crossing is a really good one for us. It's won some awards, and we're focused on, the best quality you can have with a Canadian whiskey.
And Harlan, I like to do a little shout out when we get started here, and we have Peter says Berlin says a friendly hello to everyone. So we got folks from Berlin. We've got folks from all over actually tuning in today. But yeah, looks like Puerto Rico. Hello from Puerto Rico, North Carolina, and Independence, Kentucky. John says, good to see you again, Harlan. Pam's from, looks like Beach Island, South Carolina, and we have North Georgia from Zach Brooks. So
South Carolina.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up.
Okay.
So South Carolina is about the same size as Ireland or Scotland, size-wise. Mm-hmm. And those two places, kind of like Kentucky. Kentucky's slightly bigger than Scotland and Ireland, but they put out the majority of the, originally Irish whiskey was the most, that put out more whiskey than anybody. And then, of course, Scotch took over that. And then, but with Irish whiskey, it's a lot of the same regulations as the Scotch, but the main difference between an Irish whiskey, not to mention it's made in Ireland, but the fact that generally they don't use peated malt. And so it's maybe a smoother, less smoky. And what I mean by peated is, they're taking peat, which was naturally formed. It's basically considered a fossil fuel. And when they burn that peat, it creates a smoky flavor, and that's how they utilize that through the malt to create that malted barley. And that smoky flavor carries through in the distillation, and that's how the Scotch guys are getting that smoky, peated flavor. But the Irish guys are not using that generally. They can distill up to 100. It has to be lower than 190 proof. Of course, made in Ireland. They can add caramel as color because they're using used barrels, but they can't add the flavor like the Canadian whiskey can. But they can add a little color if they wanted to. Some people don't. They are limited a little bit because they can only store it in barrels that are less than 700 liters. And to give you some perspective, a bourbon barrel is about 200 liters. So they can use big barrels. Most of them don't. Typically they use used bourbon barrels, which are 200 liter. But they also are required to age it for 3 years. So that's all those things are the same as the Scotch. But again, they're just made in Ireland, and different stills. Every still has its own character. Generally, they have different varieties, but generally they can use pot stills or they can use continuous stills. It just depends on what the maker wants to do. And another thing that's unique, especially with the Scotch, I always thought single malt Scotch meant that it was one malt, but really the word single means single distillery. So if you say single malt Scotch, that means that it was made at one distillery, made with malted barley. And if you say single grain Scotch, that would mean single distillery made with grain whiskey. When they have those different types of Scotch, that's you just have to know what the words mean. But generally there's about 30 distilleries there in Ireland, and they're making a lot of really good whiskeys and different styles, and they have to of course put it in a bottle more than 40% or 80 proof, similar to the bourbons. But those are kind of the differences. This second one here is the Irish whiskey.
I always get a lot of grain forward notes on Irish whiskey. Is that what you're picking up on?
Yeah,
Patty,
you get
too?
the grains, but it's very mellow and mild flavor. And
yeah, you mentioned around 30, I think just what we say, between 30 and 35 or so Irish distilleries or Irish whiskey distilleries in Ireland. What about Canadian whiskey. We see a lot of Canadian whiskey brands. There's
a couple, several hundred, over a couple hundred distilleries. A lot of them are pretty small. There's some main players. It's very similar to this industry, to our bourbon industry. There's some bigger players, but a lot of smaller guys have over the last 10 years have started and making a lot of Canadian, good Canadian whiskey.
And Mary on looks like Buffalo Trace Distillery Facebook does ask, how do we get this Canadian whiskey? I mean, this is distributed. I see it here in Kentucky.
We do sell it across the country. It's of course probably pretty limited, but you can get it. We sell it in Kentucky. We sell it in course in Canada. It's a little bit global, but not much. And, we started that brand it's probably been 10 years ago that we developed that, but it's getting out there. It's a national brand for us.
Great. All right, so we're moving on to our Scotch.
Our Scotch is our Glenfarclas example here. It's generally with the Scotches they'll put the ages on there. In Scotland, just like with Ireland, you've got different environments than we do here in Kentucky. But it's good to know the age. It just kind of gives you an indication of how long it's been, aging in that wood. Again, used barrels, and the big thing about Scotland, again, has to be aged at least 3 years. It gives it that, basic character. You can't really add things to it that are not retaining the original flavor. That's important. You can add color, but you can't add, flavors. Less than 190 proof distilled, higher than 80 proof in the bottle. A lot of those are similar to our bourbons. But the main, again, this is the category of whiskey. So what's the difference between Scotch and bourbon? Scotch is a type of whiskey. These are all whiskeys. Bourbon is a type, and Scotch is a type. And with the Scotch, they've got different kinds of Scotch. Again, the single malt Scotch, which is a single distillery made with malt. You've got blended malt Scotch, which is a blend of multiple distilleries. But about 90% of all Scotches are just called blended Scotch whiskey. And what you're doing on a blended Scotch whiskey is you can take multiple distilleries and you can use continuous stills. You can use different types of grain. You can add it to the malt to give it and the malt gives it that extra flavor. So it just gives them complete flexibility. So most of the Scotches that are on the market, if you say single malt Scotch, it's a lot more difficult to find because there's less of it, just kind of like our single barrel. And then you got things like blended grain. But again, with the Scotch guys, they're using that peated, some of them are using that peated malt, which gives it that smoky character. One time we did a full tasting of a lot of the Scotches we could get off the shelf. There's probably 80 different Scotches I tasted, and really there was so much variety, and a lot of these Scotches taste like bourbons. So there's just a lot of different variety of Scotches, and you really just have to determine how much of that peat, how much of that smoke do I like, what age do I like. It's kind of like with all the whiskeys, the variety is there for you to pick based on your personal preference. And what I always tell those Scotch guys, that guy sitting in Scotland that I had a nice conversation with about making bourbon, I said, it's okay to like both. You can like Scotch and you can like bourbon. You don't have to pick one. That's the beauty of it. If you've got an occasion where you want to see some smoke and some peat, just try that Scotch. And same way with the bourbons. If you want a nice, smooth, mellow, sweet, long-lasting, beautiful flavor, then you try the bourbon. So
yeah, totally. And I was thinking the same, Harlan, on just the variety of Scotches. Like it's kind of all over the place. There's a lot of variety, and I think that's because they have quite a bit more flexibility than bourbon does.
They do. Again, Scotch is about the size of South Carolina, but if you divide that up, which they've done, they've got Highlands, they've got Lowlands, they've got Speyside, which is fairly new, but the majority of the distilleries are in that Speyside area. and then they've got the Islays area. And all those regions give it different flavors based on the way they distill, the way they utilize those pot stills and their stills. They all give it a little bit different flavors.
Yeah. And real quick, another shout out on the Eagle Rare page, Eagle Rare Facebook page. Eugene from Brooklyn, Shane from Oxford, Ohio, and Phil from Rochester, New York. Glad you guys are tuning in from the Eagle Rare page. But yeah, so what else we got here?
So that's some good variety. Now, the one thing we do, we're filming here from Buffalo Trace, and we're focused on our flagship is of course Buffalo Trace. It's a Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey. That's what we know and what we've done for over 240 years. We've also make the rye whiskey. That's a variety of whiskey. It's not a bourbon, but we use the same regulations as bourbon. We just change up that recipe. So instead of a bourbon, which in order to be a bourbon, it has to have at least 51% corn in it. That's the recipe regulation. With a rye, if you want to call it rye whiskey, it has to have a majority of the grain has to be rye, or 51% rye. So that's the main difference between rye whiskey and the bourbons is the recipe. We utilize the same stills, the same yeast, the same barrel specs. We're just aging it up under that recipe with a rye whiskey. Now, one thing that sometimes we get this question, in Canada, it's okay to call Canadian whiskey rye whiskey. So that's a little confusing to some people, especially if you're from Canada, because they're used to, if you say rye whiskey, they think you mean Canadian whiskey. And all that means is it's a Canadian whiskey with a little bit of rye in it. It does not have to have majority rye. It's just part of the regulation, evolution of their regulation, because they add a little bit of rye to give it flavor. And just the local people would say, I want the rye whiskey, and that's what they start. And it's actually part of the regulation up there. So there's a little bit of confusion on that, but rye whiskey here in the States and what we call rye whiskey, you have to have the majority of the grain has to be rye.
Gotcha. Yeah. Again, we're just getting a lot of shout outs on where we're, from Alaska, Fort Mitchell, Charleston, West Virginia. So I just want to mention those folks. Before we move on to bourbon, there is a few more questions, but this could be in the bourbon category once we start talking. But Rick does ask, he's got a small batch question about bourbon. So let's get into the bourbons, and I'll ask you later.
Okay.
Yep.
So within the bourbon category, that's these last three. Within the bourbon category, the fun part about it is you can have a lot of variety of bourbons. As long as you're matching those regulations and staying within those boundaries, like 51% corn, the rest has to be grain. You can't distill it higher than 160 proof. It has to go in a bottle above 80 proof. You can't add any color to it. You have to age it in a new charred oak barrel. Those regulations are really meant to protect the overall flavor of the bourbon. And but within those regulations, you can say, for example, this one is a wheated bourbon. That's a Weller bourbon. So it's majority corn, just like the rest. However, we take the rye out, we put wheat in, and that just gives it that different recipe. And then we age it up, of course, in different locations. But that gives us a different variety of bourbon. Still Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey, but it's got wheat in it instead of rye. And that's our third from last year. I can't pass that one up without nosing that.
That's right.
But with the bourbons, with a new barrel, a new charred oak barrel, you're just going to get a whole lot more flavor, a little bit more tannins from the wood. It's what we say is most of the time it's like a new tea bag versus a used tea bag when you're dipping it in hot water. So you're just going to get full flavor out of that barrel. The hard part though is you have to age it gracefully. So it'd be tough to age this barrel of bourbon 50 years, for example, that you could do with a Scotch because of that reason. So how do you do that and still retain a good flavor throughout the 50 years? And that's some of the things we're working on through our experimental program.
I think that's a great point, because we do see a lot of older Scotches, a lot of age stated scotches 30, 40 years, and not so many on the bourbons. But I think you explained that really well. It's a new barrel. Our environment and our atmosphere and our weather is really aggressive here. Aging it gracefully
gives it that more, a lot more flavor. And then the Eagle Rare for us is we don't use wheat, we use rye. So we use majority corn and then rye, and then all these we use malted barley just like they do, but we're after the enzymes, a little bit of flavor, but mainly after enzymes, and that gives us the ability to ferment and produce this bourbon. So this is a 10-year-old. We age it differently than the Buffalo Trace, but it's a 10 years in a new charred oak barrel. So again, gives it a little bit more barrel flavors, and mellows out that original flavor of the distillate. And it's actually our most award-winning bourbon that we have on our site. It wins, because of the age and the flavor, it wins a lot of awards. So.
Yeah, it's definitely a favorite. We've got an interesting question that I think has been a confusion point around bourbon over the years. I think it's starting to get cleared up now. But Ryan asked, only bourbon is from Kentucky, correct? So that's used to. I think that was a big question.
Well, if you go back about 20 years, that would almost be true. And 99% of all the bourbon was made in Kentucky. We might have had a few other distilleries across the country, but over the last 20 years, what we've seen is because of less regulation, easier to get into the market, the demand is at an all-time high, and with perfect certainty, anytime the demand grows like it has, you're gonna get pioneers that go out in the industry and try to get into the business. So in every state of the U.S., we've had people start distilleries. We're up over 2,000 distilleries in the country now, and they're all, a lot of them are making bourbon.
Mm-hmm.
Not all of them, but probably, if I had to guess, I would say half of them are making bourbon. Mm-hmm. And they're making really good bourbons. There's a lot of variety. It depends on what you like. It's difficult because in Kentucky, we're very fortunate. One of the reasons that all the Kentucky distilleries have made it as long as they have for over 240 years in the history, there's a lot of different reasons, but we've got ideal weather conditions. We've got ideal water conditions, not to mention distribution and things like that, but we've got the ideal situation for making good bourbon. And that's why, we started out with a bunch of distilleries. They all went away. We had about 9 distilleries 20 years ago. And then we had this big, massive expansion now. And, when you go to a different state, you have to take into consideration, how's the weather different down here in the South? How's it different in the North? You have to take that in consideration as your bourbon ages. So you're just going to get a huge variety. It depends, if you manage it properly, you can make really good bourbon. A lot of them are doing that.
Mm-hmm. And like you said, the history is here too. So I think a lot of it, our weather, our water, our things like that. But let's be honest, there's a lot of talent here too. A lot of talent in Kentucky for making whiskey.
Yeah, we've been very fortunate to have a lot of people, a lot of seniority here with a lot of institutional knowledge that's been passed on. Standards been passed on for decades. So we do have a little bit of a head start over the competition, and we're going to continue that. We're pressing hard to continue to make the best bourbon we can make. And compete in the marketplace.
Yeah, if you think about where most of the whiskey comes from in the world, we've touched on Ireland and Scotland, and it's really Kentucky and Tennessee. Tennessee's got a lot going on.
Tennessee does have a lot. They're of course, they've got the big brand down in down there. But when you look at Kentucky, Tennessee, again, the size of Kentucky is a little bit bigger than Scotland. But what you're looking at, Ireland, Scotland, Kentucky, we're still at 99 or 98.8% of all the whiskey made in the country, in the world. I'm sorry, in the world.
Right.
So, that's changing a little bit. But again, we're focused on trying to, continue to make good products.
And you've pretty much answered this, but on Buffalo Trace Distillery Facebook page, Susan does ask, what do you think about the explosion of bourbons from other states?
Well, I think it's been really good for consumers. It gives them the ability to, pick something local. If they live in a local area and they've got a local distillery they can support, I think it's good for that. It's good for business. I think it opens the eyes up to consumers. They know that there's variety out there. So really it's all about competing, and we like that, and you can go down the aisle. I think for us it's all about being confident in our products, that we've been doing that for 240 years, and you can go down the aisle, look for something that's made at Buffalo Trace, and that we've made that from experience, and it should be consistent as well from batch to batch. So that's what it's all about for us. This last one, of course, is the Buffalo Trace. That's our flagship bourbon. That's the one that we started from scratch in 1999, and it continues to grow. It's relatively new to the market compared to these other things, but it's our flagship, the one we're most proud of, and it's starting to become global. It's starting to become well known, award winning, and it's a rye bourbon. It's an 8-year-old standard, 90 proof in the bottle, and it's doing well.
There was a great question. I'm looking for it. So sorry, I'm not going to be able to call you out by name, but there was a great question about as technology grows in this industry, how has technology advanced or changed the industry versus just handed down notes and knowledge like that? How does technology affect it?
It's been a blend. So what we've done is we've utilized technology to save all of the institutional knowledge that we've developed over the years. So we've preserved that through technology. We've made sure that all of our processes haven't changed. We're able to monitor things a lot closer. For us, it's all about being consistent, developing whiskeys consistently the way we've done it through the years, and we want to ensure that that's always going to be the case. So we've utilized technology to be able to do that, and it's definitely improved, in my opinion, improved quality and consistency throughout the market. I mean, everybody's doing that, and it's easier for people to operate things and do things based with newer technologies, of course.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's like being consistent with where we were and being able to keep it from now on. Yeah. Doug has a good question, and just a few more, Harlan. I know we're coming on 30 minutes here. We've kept you long enough, but Doug asked, what exactly is the meaning of small batch? So yeah, I think it's a great question. When a bourbon is a small batch, what does that actually mean?
Well, there's a few, kind of like with the talked about with the Scotch, with the blended and the single malt and all that. With bourbons, we have the same kind of categories. We have everyday bourbon, I guess, and then we have single barrel bourbon, where we actually go and pick one barrel and process that barrel individually and bottle it one barrel at a time. And then we have something called small batch bourbons. And the thing about small batches, there's not really a regulation. So it just depends on the distillery. For us, 300 or 400 barrels is considered a small batch. Some distilleries might be 2,000 or 3,000. It just depends. There's no regulation on what small batch means, but it's really just an indicator that the distillery is focused on making sure that quality is there. They're just taking the extra effort to make sure the quality is good.
Yeah. So regulations meaning just like barrel count. It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter.
Could be 2 barrels if somebody wanted to.
With Buffalo Trace, we're doing really small batches, 300 barrels at a time or so, but we do also sell 1 barrel at a time. Mm-hmm. So, through our single barrel program. Mm-hmm. So, that can be 1 barrel to 300. Just depends on which batch you're tasting.
That's right. Well, I think we've covered a lot, and we're going to have to keep some of this for future Whiskey Wednesdays. But today was a variety of whiskey, and I think it really defines what we're trying to do with Whiskey Wednesday is get some education out there on some of these products and chat about it. And the crowd has been super responsive. Thank you so much for keeping the communication going and the questions dropping. Harlan, any closing statements here?
No, well, for us with Buffalo Trace, we're always focused on delivering variety. We want the highest quality bourbons and whiskeys out there. And so this is just a good example of how much variety is out there and what to look for, when you're shopping.
Mm-hmm. And again, expansion's going on, big investment out here to make sure we're
Make more whiskey.
Make more whiskey, make more of the favorite brands, and keep it going. So, all right, Harlan, appreciate your time, as
No
always.
problem. Thank you.